Good morning and welcome to everyone here in the room at the National Academy of Sciences and also who are logging in via webcast. We're glad that you're part of this meeting today. Without further ado, I'm Melissa Perry. I am the co-chair of the Committee on Emerging Sciences and Environmental Health Decision Making, and also a member of the organizing committee for this workshop on personal environmental exposures. And without further ado, I'm really honored and delighted to introduce the director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, who will be giving us her welcoming remarks, and that's Linda Birnbaum. Welcome, Linda.
So good morning, everyone. I have to say, while I see a lot of very familiar faces, I also see a lot of new ones, and I think that's great. Now, let's see. Can I control the slides, or do you control them? Aha. Thank you. So what I really want to do today is just start off with a very little introduction about NIEHS. For those of you who are not familiar with who we are kind of unique in the firmament of the 27 institutes and centers, being the only one not located in Bethesda, Maryland. We're headquartered in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. We're there because that was the time that politics works. And it was a time when Jack Kennedy paid Terry Sanford, the governor of North Carolina, back for delivering North Carolina to his presidential campaign in 1960. And as a result of that, there was a strong commitment to environmental health, both from Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And NIEHS was actually established as a division at really within NCI. In November 1st, 1966. So this has been a really big, exciting year for us. It's our 50th anniversary. We've been having celebrations throughout the course of the year. We had a very exciting November 1st, 50 years exactly, celebration about 2 weeks ago. And we're looking forward to doing something that's never been done before, as far as I know, at any institute. But we're bringing together literally over 1,000 of our grantees, all of our center programs, the leadership of those, plus many, many grantees. We have over 1,200 people registered for what we're calling a Centers Fest, or an Environmental Health Centers Fest, in Durham, North Carolina, the week of December 5th through 8th, and we're very excited about getting so many of our grantees together. There are real opportunities for synergy and interaction that'll be going on there. If you are interested and have not yet signed up, we have a waiting list. We know that some of those 1,200 people will end up, not being able to come for one reason or another. So please sign up, get your name on the waiting list, and we'd love to have you join us. Some of the activities, in addition to all the great science that's going to be going on for the whole week, we're also having a tour of Old Durham, 2 nights of walking tours that people can kind of walk around and see Old Durham, and we're having a pub crawl, and which is very good in Durham. We've kind of become like Colorado a little bit, a lot of local breweries. And then we're actually having a film fest one night as well in a historic theater that's about 100 years old. So it should be an exciting time. But back to what NIEHS is and does. Like any NIH institute, we have a very vigorous intramural research program, or division of intramural research. We also have our extramural program, which is, of course, like any institute, that's where most of the money goes out, so that we fund grants in almost every state in the country. Some of those small population states may not have grants, but almost all do, as well as many places throughout the world. We have a couple things that make us unique in addition to our location. One is that our focus is on prevention, much more so than treatment and cures. That doesn't mean that certain cures have not been found by NIEHS scientists and our grantees, but the focus is really on the environment and how, by changing our environment, we can improve our health as we go forward. We have a clinical program. I was the first director to establish actually an on-site clinical research program, so we actually have a day clinic in the parking lot, I will admit, but it still works very well. And we have about 23 active protocols, and we actually have we have an asthma clinic now and a adolescence clinic, actually recruiting subjects to participate in studies, as well as bringing in lots of people to take biospecimens and so on as we go forward. Another thing that we have, which is unique, is that we are both the headquarters and the major funders of the National Toxicology Program, which was legislatively established in 1978, so coming up on its 40th anniversary. And it is a organization that involves NIH, FDA, and CDC. But again, it's headquartered at NIEHS. When I wear that hat, technically I actually report to the secretary, whoever that may be. And I should say that in addition, as I said, we are the major funders, but unlike the basic intramural program at any institute which is focused on basic biomedical research, the NTP is a problem-solving organization. Its goal is to develop new test methods and new test systems, do the testing, evaluate the testing. We are actually legislative mandated to release a report on carcinogens every 2 years. The 14th report went out early this month, and it was actually 2 years and 2 months. So we're pretty proud of that since the 13th. I won't tell you how long it took to get from the 12th to the 13th, but this one just went out, and it's a cumulative list. So there are now 248 substances that are on the list. And I say substances because there are biologicals, there are viruses, there are complex mixtures on the list, as well as individual chemicals. We are also legislatively mandated to advance the 3 Rs. And we have a group called NICEDM, which runs the Interagency Committee of ICVAM for the validation of alternative methods, which used to be a 15-member federal agency member committee. It is now up to 16. NIST has recently joined us as one of the members. And we've kind of reconfigured how this committee works. And very much the focus now is on having the regulators, because these are all agencies that have a regulatory authority, what do they need in order to improve their policy decisions? Not what we think they need, but for them to tell us what to need. So recently, actually, ICFAM has validated an OECD and the EPA, the endocrine screening program has accepted that there are 17 different in vitro assays for estrogen receptor binding that can be utilized instead of some of the whole animal studies for whether or not something can function as an estrogen. So I think that's been an important thing. The other program that we have, which is again very unique to an NIH institute, is we have the Superfund program. This actually is funded from a different appropriations committee in Congress, the same committee that funds EPA, and the same committee that funds the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry down in Atlanta. And our Superfund program, again, is another problem-solving program that is supposed to deal with understanding the potential hazards around hazardous waste sites in the U.S. Predominantly. Now, the Superfund program has 2 parts. One part is a research program, which I changed the name. It used to be called the Superfund Basic Research Program. And I said, no, this is really not basic research. This is a problem-solving program. The Superfund program is entirely a grantee program. We have 14, forget the exact number, well, it's up for competition right now. Anyhow, but we have about 14 to 17 different Superfund centers throughout the country that are dealing with local and then national issues as well. In addition to the research program, there's another part of the Superfund funding that goes to training of workers in emergency response and hazardous waste cleanup. And we've trained over 3 million workers in the last close to 30 years since the Superfund amendments were passed in 1986, but over 3 million workers in every state and territory of the U.S. And every time there's an emergency, people that we have trained are on the ground involved in the cleanup. And many times our leadership at NIEHS, our program officers and that are involved in helping to provide the training so that people can clean things up well. So for example, one recent example is with the mess in Flint, which is a clear example of environmental injustice. Our Superfund grantees both Superfund grantees dealing with community groups, because you can't do environmental health sciences unless the community is engaged from the very beginning. So that University of Michigan, where we have both a children's center and an environmental health core center, Wayne State, which has an environmental health core center, and Michigan State, which has a Superfund program, all have teams that are involved working with the communities, helping them understand and deal with the problem. And our emergency response and hazardous waste cleanup folks are in there making sure that as they replace the lead pipes throughout the city of Flint, that they're done in a safe manner so that you don't lead to additional exposure, both to the workers as well as people in the area. So that's kind of an introduction to who NIEHS is. Let's see. And this is our strategic plan. Now, again, for those of you who are NIEHS gurus, and you may have seen all of this, but our strategic plan was developed and released in the end of 2012. It goes through next year, so I can tell you, keep your ears open, because sometime next year we'll begin to solicit stakeholder input again to look at the strategic plan that we already have and say, you know, how does this need to be updated? What are some of the key issues that we may want to bring on? But the mission of NIEHS is to discover how the environment affects people in order to promote healthier lives. And the vision is that we will provide the global leadership for innovative research that improves public health by preventing disease and disability. You can't do any of this kind of work without having a collaborative and integrative approach, and you have to be able to develop ways to manage the huge amounts of not only data but knowledge that's being generated by all the research. And then there are basically 6 fundamental areas within it, which are cross-cutting themes involving fundamental research, exposure, translation, health disparities, and global training and communications. And I think it's very important that we think quite a bit about the issues of trying to educate and improve the science literacy of our country, as well as training the next generation. And I'm going to come back to that. So we are the primary, if most of the time the only funders of this series of workshops by emerging science and environmental health decision-making. And these are just some examples of some of the workshops that we've held over the past couple of years. This program really began or was enlarged in 2009, shortly after I became director, to bring in a lot of government liaisons to this committee as well, so that we're really trying to get decision makers aligned with some of the emerging science. So we've had workshops on applications of in vitro technologies, focusing on the microbiome. I think you can't pick up an issue of science or nature without seeing some really interesting work about how we really may begin to, while a lot of people focus on genetics and genomics, maybe we better consider the microbiome as part of the genetics and genomics to understand the impacts of what we're looking at. We're looking at issues of individual variability and susceptibility. I've often been heard to say I'm actually amazed that we found anything in some of the NTP testing programs where all we did was test adult animals, and that in fact the developing organism is uniquely susceptible to long-term impacts of exposures, and obviously there are multiple periods in our life when we have that. And then characterizing the human exposome, and that's clearly related to the topics that we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to go really quick because I know the red lights are flashing already. And I really want to get into the heart of the meeting. But I just quickly to tell you, whoops, okay, back to our strategic plan. But this is just some of the important things that we have 11 goal topics. Again, for those of you who know me, we have 11 because my husband's a mathematician and he thinks prime numbers are much more important than dealing with 10 or 12 or something like that. So 11 is a good number. And but this is the basic science goal number 1, where we're not like other institutes that focus either on a specific disease or a specific age range. We've got to do it all, and understanding the role of the environment in that. The second is, I've already talked a little bit about individual susceptibility, which can be driven by many different topics, but this goal is really focusing on the issue of lifespan. And I will tell you that while so much of our focus until recently has been almost exclusively on in utero exposure as a really critical window, and maybe infantile exposure, and maybe a little bit about what is happening to the mom and her susceptibility during pregnancy, I'm talking now about Dads Matter, and we better start focusing on preconceptional exposures as well. Jermaine Buck-Lewis is in the audience, and she's published a couple of really key papers on, sorry Jermaine to call you out, but some really key papers showing about the preconceptional impacts of exposures. And then our other goals, number 3 is our exposure goal. And again, we really do want to transform exposure science, and that's moving into the exposome. That's not forgetting about the key issues that biomonitoring can tell us about what exposure has occurred, but we're really interested in the totality as well. Goal 4 is the fact that we live in a soup of exposures, and our exposures are not only chemical exposures. We're exposed to substances that you may abuse. We're exposed to drugs. We're exposed to infectious agents. We're exposed to nutrients. And all those things have a chemical basis, and we need to look at combined exposures and how they play a role. Number 5 is, I think, a very exciting goal. This is the responding to emerging environmental threats. And some of the emerging threats, for example, things like new technologies are, that we use them in a way that's consistent with good public health practice. So think about what's going on with nanotechnology. Frankly, every time I see somebody talk about carbon nanotubes, especially the double-wall ones, if they've got reactive metals on the surface, that kind of looks like asbestos. Maybe we should be thinking about that. Or we think about fracking, where we're beginning to see evidence from a number of studies of adverse health impacts of people living in areas where fracking has occurred. And I'm not talking about not only the issues of the flowback water and the generation of earthquakes as a result of their injection into deep wells. But I think the emerging environmental threat has actually led us to a whole new area that we're doing in this thing called disaster research response. And this is a program that's across NIH effort and is also across HHS effort, and also involves people from EPA and USGS and several of the other federal agencies. But this is, you need to understand what is happening when you have an emergency. Now, you can't get involved with interfering with the emergency response, but if we're ever going to be able to respond better, as well as protect our emergency response workers better, we've got to conduct research. And that really was pointed up at the time of the Gulf oil spill, where we moved heaven and high water to get in the field to do a follow-up study on the health impacts of people who were involved in the cleanup. I mean, we did everything as fast as you could, and it still took us 9 months to get into the field. And that's too late if you need to get an acute response. So right now, if you're interested, go on the National Library of Medicine website, put in disaster research response, and there are over 300 separate protocols and approaches and information that you can use. We now have an IRB pre-approved protocol to use in a disaster. Obviously, when it happened, we'd have to get an amendment, so which should only take a day or two so we can get in the field. And 3 of our grantee centers programs have also taken theirs to their local IRBs and are ready to roll when the next emergency, whether man-made or natural, occurs. And we know that they will happen. The 6th goal is focusing on environmental health disparities both in the U.S. and globally. And I think this is the issue that we're beginning to understand. We should have understood a long time ago that the social dimensions are extremely important in health and interact with other kinds of environmental exposures, and that we often know that it's the people who are most disadvantaged or the people who are most at risk. We all know about NIMBY. It's not in my backyard. It's in those other people's backyards, and those are the ones that are most at risk. Goal 7 is the knowledge management goal, that we have to have a collaborative environment and work interdisciplinarily. Goal 8 is the goal of scientific literacy, and I think becoming very, very obvious to many of us that the level of science literacy in our country as a whole is woefully inadequate. So this involves working not only in the schools and the K through 12 scenario. Many of our grantees have in their engagement programs with communities are working in the schools, for example, but it also involves going out and trying to communicate issues with the general public as well. I hold a whole series of community forums. I've held 17 of them over the last couple of years, where I meet with disadvantaged communities and listen to their concerns, because that's how we can understand where we really need to be spending our efforts. Goal 9 is the training goal. We have 42 training programs that we fund throughout the country, ranging from exposure science to biostatistics, epidemiology, toxicology, a wide variety of topics. Obviously, we have to train the next generation, and we need to bring into environmental health some non-traditional kinds of groups that we haven't necessarily previously thought, like people in the social and behavioral sciences, like engineers, like mathematicians, and so on, if we're going to continue to develop environmental health sciences. Goal 10 is one that was very passionate about, I'm still passionate about, which is the only way to make to help others who are not scientists value some of the work that we do, is tell them how much it costs. And so some of our grantees are working, there's been a lot of work done on how much lead costs. So in fact, David Bellinger of Harvard, Leo Tresandi of NYU have both done work there, estimating the cost, just focusing on the lost IQ points, not focusing on the behavioral problems, not focusing on the cardiovascular or renal problems that are associated with elevated lead. But just on that, worldwide, the costs of lead exposure are over $1 trillion a year. Those are big money figures. The exposure, though, to, for example, chlorpyrifos, lead, and methylmercury in this country are estimated to exceed the costs that are spent on medical treatment for example, heart conditions or neurotoxicity, developmental neurological effects, but in the order of about $220 billion a year. So these are the kinds of numbers that we need to make the case for the importance of doing something about our environment. And 11 is the goal that I kind of mentioned at the beginning, is that we've got to promote bidirectional communication so that the environmental health scientists, we need to talk to our stakeholders, and that's all of our stakeholders, whether it's industry or advocacy groups, and we need to work also very closely with the press, for example, so to get our message clearly and accurately said. Now, getting into the topic of today's meeting, which has to do with ways to measure personal exposure, we led, that's NIEHS led the roadmap program that started in about 2006 or a little bit earlier at NIH on genes in the environment. We led the exposure biology part. And the goal of this was to develop basically sensors. So these are just examples of some of the sensors that were developed. We weren't just developing sensors for chemical exposure measurements. We were looking at things like diet and physical activity, and I'm looking, we, again, when I say we, I mean our grantees, it's the royal we, developed a very pretty pendant that could be worn that was actually a little camera and could take pictures of what people ate, so you could actually have a better measure of what somebody ate than dietary recall. There are measures of physical activity, psychosocial stress was being measured, lots of measurements for air pollution and other chemical hazard evaluation, and then looking at early biological response indicators as well. Many of these were developed. And then some other tools that have been developed as part of our portfolio. This is one of my favorite, the ones in your upper right hand. Those are the silicone wristbands that were developed by Kim Anderson and colleagues at Oregon State University. And these are embedded with sensors. They can pick up at least 100 different chemicals. They've used this in a number of different settings. For example, with people who were working on putting down asphalt, they were able to pick up 24 different PAHs, among many other compounds, for example, in these sensors. They're actually being used now in field trial in one of our children's health centers and looking at children's exposure. The only problem we ran into with children is they didn't want to give them back because they like their brightly colored silicone bracelets. So there was an easy solution to that, just to give them silicone bracelets that didn't have the sensors in them. So I think this is a very exciting new approach for personal monitoring. Some of our scientists at Cincinnati developed a personal ultrafine particle counter that weighed about 2 pounds. And also the development, for example, of other personal particle counters that can be worn by kids. And one of the things that came out of this is they used it at kids riding the bus to and from school. It turns out that riding your bus, if you've got on a diesel bus, is probably not a very healthy environment for your child to be in. Now, I'm not telling you to go idle your car outside the kids' school so that, you know, they're not riding the bus, then you just kind of transfer some of the pollution. I think that we need to think about how this exposure focus connects to other strategic priorities and initiatives that NIH is focusing on now. Personalized medicine is one of them, but really the term is now we're working on is precision medicine, which is trying to understand the interaction not only of genomics but of environmental exposures to your contribution to your health, the big data to knowledge, which is a huge effort in the extramural community. working on ways to deal with the tremendous onslaught we have of data and the need for many, many more bioinformaticians and bioinformatic approaches to deal with it, as well as the need and what is becoming a requirement for data to be completely freely available to all investigators. Anyone who's doing any genomics data knows that they've got to get their data into dbGaP within 3 months of collection of it. That's supposed to give you enough time for you to have first dibs at publishing it. And then the whole issue of citizen science, because as I said before, when we deal with communities and we deal with individuals, they're the ones who can help us understand what are the issues that they are dealing with. Plus, there have been some amazing findings that citizen scientists have been able to gather. So thank you. Sorry I ran over a little bit, but I was excited to tell you about the work that NIEHS is doing, introduce you to NIEHS, and get this committee off to a really great start. Thank you.